Hello, this is Scott, and today I'm going to talk about resolution and just how much do you need. Whether things like the kind of average 24.2 megapixel, 25 megapixels is enough, or whether you need one of the newer sensors that has 33 megapixels. We'll look at the pros and the cons. Okay, as you know, I'm fond of the Panasonic S5, and it's only a 24.2 megapixel. And now we have the S5 II, and it's the same 24 point whatever megapixel sensor. And some people are like, oh, you know, Sony has the new 33 megapixel sensor, and everyone gets caught up in the megapixels. I'm going to make an argument for that 24 is still the sweet spot. There is a lot of pros and cons, and it will particularly depend upon you personally and what you do. Now, the first thing I'm going to sit there and say, at 24 megapixels, I used to have a inkjet printing company, and a lot of people get their prints as inkjets. And in the world of inkjets, I did like tests where I sat there, because some people will sit there and say, you got to print at 300 dpi. I disagree. When I did my tests, it's like anything over 175 dpi was almost imperceivable as far as being better. I will say the more detail you have, the higher you can go versus a low. So I used to say it was potentially okay to print within the 125 to 175 dpi range. And if you work at 125, you can literally make a 48 by 32 inch print. So that's pretty huge. More than most of us will do. And at 175, you can make a 34 by, what do I got here? 22.9, 22.87, whatever, print. It's still pretty large, and not what we would typically do for regular users. Now, I have taken prints and printed them much larger, so there are ways to get more out of less. I used to have a 1DS. I shot houses, basically shooting driveways, and one of those had to be blown up to an 8-foot by 10-foot display exhibit, and used techniques back then, because the 1DS was only a 8-9 megapixel camera, but it amazingly looked absolutely wonderful. And then you also have to keep into mind viewing distances. So most of the time you're not going to be right on top of something that you blow large. You're going to be looking at it from afar. Now, I would sit there and say that's an exception would be landscape, because in landscape you might want to come up and really look at the details. So resolutions, I would say, important there, but for many typical applications it's not the dial. And if really you think resolution is, then you should be looking at 100 megapixels, and I'll go into that as well. So let me go to the computer. I'm going to show you the tool where I look at things and kind of show you what using that. And this is the from DP Review. It has an excellent tool where they show you images at different ISOs from different cameras. Because it's like I don't have access to all these cameras, so I have to rely on someone like that who has done the work, and hopefully they won't be offended by me showing you how I use their tool. But it's a great way for many of us who don't have access to seeing, using, testing the cameras. Where I live, it's like the biggest camera store would be Best Buy. So I don't have access to a lot of different types of equipment. There's really no really good carry all the brands camera store in the vicinity of where I live. So we'll go take a look at that tool, and I'll kind of tell you what I look for and kind of point things out. So let's go to the computer.
Okay, here we are. We're looking at the DP Review Studio scene. You'll find it under Sample Images at their top menu. And I think this is a really great tool for people like myself who don't have a really great camera store nearby. I think it pretty much I have Best Buy, so not a lot of ability to really see every model and be able to test it, and to have a nice independent dealer who would let you sit there and maybe go outside and take a sample image, whatever. So I have to rely on other sources, as many of you might, and this is like a great one for comparing things. And what I want to talk about is whether 24 megapixels is enough. My personal opinion is it's kind of a sweet spot. You get a decent look out of 24 megapixels. And of course, more resolution is always better. And I would definitely say if you can keep your, move this to 200 so they all match. If you can keep your ISO down, there's no penalty to more megapixels. But if, like me, you find yourself creeping sometimes towards 1600, towards 3200, which is kind of where I like to not go beyond. And if you're doing things like birds in flight, I don't have an f2.8 lens, so if I want to be at a 1,000th of a second or 1/2000th of a second, I'm going to be pushing ISO. So that's when things start to change. So again, let me explain this. This is full size, so we can see this one's 24, this one's 33 megapixels, this one I think is like 40 something, and this one's like 60 something. So you can see they kind of get bigger and bigger. They have a neat little tool here that's called comparison, which matches it to the smallest images. So it downsizes it so it's the same size as smallest, which was going to be the S5. So if we hit that, now we're kind of looking at the same image, and we can see that the higher resolution is giving us sharper. But here's the whole scene, and you can take this little box and you can move it around. So I'm going to move it over here, because basically we're not looking at color. Don't know why that one's a little bit yellow. We're relying that they did a good job when they took these pictures. And something, it's kind of interesting, they sit there and have notes, like this one says it's white balance corrected and exposure corrected. And the same here. I'd like to know how much they changed things and why they would have had to. But we're just going to accept that these are pretty good for comparison purposes. So at 200, they all look pretty good, except for this one's kind of odd coloring. I jump that up to 400. Even at this reduced size, we're starting to see more noise here and here, or it is maybe due to the resolution a little bit sticking out a little bit more. And go to 800. They're still okay, but again, as the resolution goes up, we're seeing the noise. And the reason I'm pointing this out is some people have made the argument that if you have a higher resolution camera and you only print it at what would be considered a proper size for the 24 megapixel sensor, that the extra resolution's downsize is going to hide the noise. If you look at this, that's just not the case. It's doing some good, but this one is still looking pretty good. But in her skin here, you can definitely see some noise building up. And then if we go to 3200, which is where I like to not go beyond with the S5, and so happy that it gives me a pretty clean 3200. The A7IV is the 33 megapixels. There is a penalty at high ISOs. Again, if you're at low ISOs, not a problem. Go for the megapixels. But if you're like me, you find yourself touching 1600 and 3200 and maybe more a little too often because of the general nature of what you're shooting, then I would say give it some thought. Now, one of the things I like about my Panasonic is if I'm shooting something that is a flat subject, I can go to pixel shift. I shouldn't say flat, a subject without movement. So I can tripod up my camera and nothing will move. Then I can get some pretty good results. And yeah, that looks fantastic. I could probably, well, let me do it at 64. Oh, okay. 3200 seems to be the limit for pixel shift. I don't use it that often, so don't know. But as you can see, it even having 60 megapixels is not enough to make up for the more detail and everything, and the fact that you're going to start to get that now. One can argue if you have enough megapixels, and let's look at something like the beautiful Fujifilm GFX at 100 megapixels. Obviously, it is glorious at 200, super smooth, one of the best. Color, maybe. Don't know what's going on there, but go up to 3200 and, you know, it's better than this. That's because it had tons of, and if we go to 6400, I would sit there and say it's really holding its own, whereas these two are starting to fall apart. And I'm sure the Sony A7IV would suffer as well. So if you can afford that camera, which I'm sure many of us would wish we could, yeah, it's great. And here's the A7R5, so you can see even at 60 megapixels, it's like at 6400, I would say that's running unusable. I would say that's unusable. I could get away with a lot of different images, and that would be okay. And this one might even be okay. So you have to kind of evaluate for yourself. It's like, okay, where's my sweet spot? How big am I going to be printing? What am I going to be shooting? What ISOs am I going to be hitting? And to make your true decisions. Now I go back to 3200 because I think that's, like I said, is my upper limit on the S5, if I can at all keep it there. But go around, look at the different complexion, different skin colors, because they all have pros and cons. Any darker skins are going to show up the noise more. If you're looking at white skin, there's not a lot of shadow to worry about. It doesn't suffer as much, so you can get away with it more. You know, it's all relative to what you're shooting, and that's why I really like DP Review's chart here, because they show you a lot of different things. You know, fine detail, hair, this moss up here. They just did a nice job with the things they chose to put in it. Here, this is showing you threads and sewing. You can see how the detail is showing. If we go to 200, you can really see the thread detail as the resolution goes up. But any of these will give you a good image. And like I said, with the Panasonic, I have the option of going to pixel shift, which now puts me in the range of the higher resolution cameras, but in a very pretty much in my world, I would be using it for copying. So if I was copying image, things like that, I would use pixel shift to get that 100 megapixel file without having a 100 megapixel camera. So again, on your own, go around, look at this. I think it's very educational. This is an interesting one over here, because even at 200, everything looks pretty good, but you'll find that you start to get this color moire in some images, and it'll happen. It's the frequency of the lines from the line work, and kind of a mismatch on the Bayer sensor. But you can see where we're getting more detail in here, but we might get color moire. There's moire in her dress. I would say this is probably one of the the better. So 60 is starting to look interesting as long as we don't go into super high ISOs. Then, a lot of the problems stick up. And again, just to give you an idea, and I would encourage you to do this yourself. If you really want to see what an image might look at, go to one of the 100 megapixels, Phase 1, Fujifilm, whomever, put it on full, and you're going to get really an idea of what the detail really is in here. Look at all these fine lines that the artist drew, or however, I guess it would have been drawn. And you can really see the detail that just turns into kind of a blur up here. It's even on here, it's still a mess at 3200. Even if we go to 200, you can see you're just not really getting what the real image is. And I always found her face here interesting because you can see this one's getting there. It's like I'd be really interested to see like a 75 megapixel camera or whatever, see what comes out next, and whether they can make, a full frame, so to speak, sensor, have that much resolution and come up looking good, because it's amazing, what the GFX produces, what it can pick up and find detail. So that's it. I don't want to belabor this and have this go on too long. So hopefully that's educational to you. Again, I think it's a great tool. We don't all have the advantage of being able to test a lot of different cameras, and this is a way to really start looking at one versus another, and definitely move all around the image and look at, because you'll start to see different things. It's like, oh, okay, wow, this detail is incredible compared to that, or even that. Even if I put it in comp, it's still, these are looking so much better. So if you do images with that kind of detail, maybe that's what you need, and you can keep your ISOs down. So there you go. There's the tools. That's what I use when I start looking around at cameras, and why one may be better for me or another. And every person has to decide that for themselves. They have to think about what they're shooting and what would be best for them. In an ideal world where I was rich, I would have probably a 24 megapixel camera, and then I would have a 100 megapixels, because 100 megapixels is great, but it's not a perfect camera either. It's got a lot of ifs, ands, and buts that go with it. So I hope that you found this interesting. My take is that for me personally, I find 24 megapixels is still the sweet spot in technology. So if you liked everything, please hit like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.